Today I'm going to talk about using science to make change happen because really that's the motivation for what we do. And it's because as environmental scientists, we've been observing these degradations going around the world, and we're not satisfied by simply documenting these declines. We want to help solve environmental problems by employing good science. To do that, we need to effectively communicate good science. So the motivation for this science communication is to help solve environmental problems. So first, a little quiz. What's your most important goal in communicating science? Is it A, impressing your audience, B, clarity, C, delivering as many facts as possible, or D, maintaining objectivity? Obviously the answer is B, clarity. You're not there to impress your audience. You're not there to cram as many facts in as possible. And you can show your passion. You don't have to be objective. You have to stop asking yourself, what do I want to say? And asking yourself, what do I want my audience to learn? Put yourself into the audience's shoes. So one way to do that, well, a key way to do that is by storytelling and visualizations, because these are the most ancient forms of human communication. These preceded the written word. People then gather around campfires or gather around and listen to stories for as long as humans have evolved out of the trees. And they've been drawing either sticks in the mud or the sand or cave paintings from tens of thousands of years ago, again, well before the written word. And it turns out the storytelling and visualization means that our brains are now hardwired to respond to those stories and visualizations. On the left, you see some MRIs of people looking at and studying movies, films, and the case study here reported by Randy Olson, I'll talk about his book in a minute, is that if people in a room are watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie, their brains are lighting up, and they're lighting up in the same way, unifying the thinking of the group. If they're watching random video, they're just daydreaming. On the right, you see the neural basis for color, and you can see the MRI skewed towards the reds, much, much higher affinity to reds. The brain stimulation when it sees red is much higher than any of the other colors. So we have this hardwired aspect. So how do we do that? How do we combine narrative and visuals to be effective in science communication? Well, you engage the audience by telling stories and providing compelling visuals. It turns out that improves the retention. People can remember a good story, and they can remember a visualization much better than a string of facts. And it's quicker. It shortens the reading time. They can follow the storyline and view the visual elements very quickly. You might think, well, gosh, we're not in the business of telling stories. We're scientists. Well, two great science philosophers, Karl Popper and Peter Medawar, had quotes that I think really get to this. Popper said, "Is one of the novelties of human language that encourages storytelling and thus creative imagination. Scientific discovery is akin to explanatory storytelling, to myth-making, and to poetic imagination." Think of that, talking about science and using the word poetic imagination. Medawar says scientific theories begin as imaginative constructions. They begin, if you like, as stories. And the purpose of the critical or rectifying episode in scientific reasoning is precisely to find out whether or not these stories are stories about real life. Okay, so it's storytelling, but it's nonfiction storytelling that we're dealing with when we're talking about science communication. There are models of communication that are in the literature called the narrative storytelling, and the contrast is the logical science communication. Narrative storytelling are specific cases from which generalizations can infer greater truths. They're practical and they're place-based. Logical science communication are abstract truths valid across a specified range of situations. They're theoretical and not place-based. Narrative storytelling has much more power, however, in communication. And they have the similar elements. They have cause-effect, this happened, and therefore this happened. They have time. They follow a timeline, past, present to future, and they involve people. They're not without people. They have characters. If you look at a TED Talk, watch a TED Talk and realize that they are telling stories. That's the approach that they use in their talks. There are many forms of visuals that can be used in the visualization aspects. You can use photos like the one on the left. You can use conceptual diagrams like the one on the right. You can use maps like the one on the left, and you can use graphs like the one on the right. Clean, crisp maps and graphics without map junk or chart junk. And videos, very powerful. Videos can be really effective at condensing information and in a short amount of time. And you can use a variety of different visual elements to enhance the appeal of your science communication. You can use them in newsletters, you can use them in peer-reviewed papers, and use them in posters. Now, I want to talk about the and but therefore format introduced by Randy Olson in this book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. Interestingly, the title of this book is a play on words having to do with Apollo 13, the ill-fated Apollo mission where there was an explosion, and the famous line uttered by Tom Hanks in the movie was, "Houston, we have a problem." In reality, it wasn't Jim Lovell, who Tom Hanks was playing. It was Ken Swigert, who said in real life, "Houston, we've had a problem here." Hollywood took that and slightly changed it. Instead of "we've had a problem," passive, past tense, it's "Houston, we have a problem," making it much more immediate and then leaving off the word "here" to make it a little punchier. Same meaning, but slight difference. So Randy's point, he and I were grad students at the same time, graduated at the same time, went to Australia at the same time, but he then went off to film school and came back after 25 years to tell scientists what he's learned from Hollywood's ability to tell stories. And he has this format, and it's summarized as "and, but, therefore." That's a template that he recommends. In contrast, most scientists' talks are and, which bores you and you fall asleep, or "despite, however, yet," which takes you on a journey but never lands. So the ABT format provides compelling narrative structure. Stories are fun and they may seem complex, but tension, they all have a similar structure. Therefore, resolution, they lend themselves to templates. So you set it up with the "and" statements, you can create tension with the "but" statement, you resolve it with a "therefore" statement. So as a scientist, I didn't accept this at face value. I wanted to check this out. So Randy and I collaborated on a little thing called narrative index. So we counted the numbers "and," "but," and "therefores," and it turns out that "therefore" was not used often enough, and then there are a lot of synonyms, so we ended up with "ands" and "buts," two very common words. And we developed a quantitative index. You can see what it is. Buts divided by ands times 100. And then I took what I thought would be the best example of testing this with the theory of natural selection. So, of course, Charles Darwin, the Englishman, it was influenced by Thomas Malthus. He was influenced by his geology instructor, Charles Lyell, and by Alexander von Humboldt, the Prussian explorer who went to South America for years. So following in Humboldt's footsteps, he made an extended field trip. He was 5 years on the voyage of the Beagle, mostly in South America, stopped in the Galapagos, came back and spent the rest of his career writing books and scientific papers. He's prolific. About the same time, very near overlap in age, Alfred Wallace, another Englishman, also influenced by the same key authors, Malthus, Lyell, and Humboldt. He too made extended field trips, 4 years in South America, 8 years in what is current day Indonesia. Also came back to England to write numerous books and scientific papers. Well, it turns out they co-published. They published in the same journal, the Proceedings of the Linnean Society, on the same day, July 1st, 1858, and they put in 2 letters from Darwin and 1 from Wallace. And Wallace had actually sent it in, and one of Darwin's friends, Hooker, said, "Hey, Charles, somebody else has your idea," so they co-published. So I call this a controlled experiment. It's the same theory, natural selection. They're both Englishmen, similar influences, similar observations, published at the same time in the same journal, and their personal charisma had nothing to do with it because neither man was present when the paper was read at the Linnean Society. But in terms of narrative index, Wallace had a narrative index of 19. Darwin had a much higher narrative index in the 2 letters that he contributed, 27 and 26. Of course, who do we know as the father of natural selection? Charles Darwin. Wallace is a footnote in history. Darwin is the one that's famous. Wallace went on to write a bunch of books, a 2-volume set on the Malay archipelago and island life, narrative index still hovering in the low teens. Darwin, much higher, consistently in his Voyage of the Beagle, his Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs book, and his Origin of Species book. Randi has gone on to take not just the Darwin-Wallace that I just analyzed, but also Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, two politicians that had been in the Senate race in Illinois. In that case, Douglas had won. But in the presidential run in 1860, it was Lincoln who prevailed. And they had a series of famous debates in which Lincoln outperformed consistently Douglas's debating style. And then Randi had been doing this for every Republican debate leading up to the 2016 election, and in fact predicted correctly that Trump had a much higher narrative intuition than Clinton. If you think about Clinton's campaign speech, Stronger Together, what was Trump? He was an implied and but therefore statement. America was great again, and America was the greatest country on earth, but America is not great anymore. Therefore, I am going to make America great again. Okay, so ABT, another key thing to consider and develop a talent of developing is active titles. An active title is the opposite of saying results or methods. It's saying what you found. In this case, in this book, we said erosion process tracing confirms model predictions, and then there's a diagram and a graph to support it. In this, on the PowerPoint, report card design inspired by the paddle wheel, and the picture of the paddle wheel and then the report card. So these are active titles, so even if you cut away the graphics and just look at the title, you get the message. So scientific narrative should focus on informing, not persuading, the audience. You're there to instruct, explain, not to change attitudes and beliefs. You're giving something to the audience rather than trying to get something from the audience. You're telling them, you're not selling them, and you're using information to persuade, but not persuasion that can use information to support the persuasion. So it's a subtle difference, but the important thing is you're giving something to the audience. Where do you start when you build a presentation? Where should your narrative start? Should it start with what and then explain how and then get to why? Or like the reporters, who, what, where, why, and when? No, it should start with why and go to how and what. And this is because there's a biological basis for this. It's because when you get to the emotional part of the brain, the limbic brain, that's where long-term memory is seated. That's where behavior and motivation is seated. The what deals with the neocortex, the thinking brain, which is the cognitive and the rational basis of an argument. We have to tap into the limbic brain to get that long-term memory and motivation. Well, I call this my dead white men slide, and I've written a paper about this, about how in the history of science in the last 500 years at least, the great paradigm shifts have occurred when great science communication occurred. So Copernicus, there in upper left, had an alternative view of the Earth going around the sun rather than vice versa, which in fact was revolutionary and created the Copernican revolution, a bloodless but powerful revolution, a revolution the way people thought. He died on his deathbed and published in 1543, so he didn't incur the wrath of the Catholic Church that Galileo, the next guy there, did by espousing the Copernican theory, and he was placed under house arrest as a result. And then Kepler in astronomy with the elliptical orbits of planets, German, and then a British man, Isaac Newton, who came up with the thermodynamics, inventing calculus along the way, and then Linnaeus, the biologist, the Swede, who started to catalog the living things that all these great voyages of adventure were bringing back from far reaches of the globe, using the Linnean system that we use today. Lavoisier, the French chemist who debunked the phlogiston theory and showed that oxygen, and basically invented chemistry, was until his head got chopped off in the French Revolution. And then Charles Lyell, the fellow that influenced both Darwin and Wallace, the geologist who showed that, the Englishman who showed that the Earth was much older than 6,000 years. And then Darwin with his theory of natural selection, upsetting the entire world to this day. Albert Einstein and E equals mc squared, and then leading into the physics revolution, and nuclear power and atomic weaponry as a result. And then the biological revolution ushered in by Watson and Crick and the discovery of DNA, the structure of DNA. And so I guess one of the questions you ask is, why are these all European white males, except for Watson's American, but the rest are European? And the reason is that's where, those are the only people that are allowed to do science back then. And they were the ones that got credit because they were the ones that were published and created those paradigm shifts. But one of the important things is the questions that the society was asking. At the beginning, they're asking, where are we in this universe? And then they were asking, how do we fit? How are we related to living and non-living things? And then they were asking, where do we come from? And then we started asking, what are we made of? To the atomic structure and the biological structure. And now we have to ask, how do we have a sustainable life on this planet with 8 billion people? And you can ask, why only dead white men? And I used as my measure, a metric there, is basically a citation classic by analysis by Charles Murray on human accomplishment. And you can see how these people ranked up. And Marie Curie, the arrow's not quite right, was the highest ranked woman. I wrote a blog about going to her lab in Paris last year. Really impressive woman. Not only did she win a Nobel Prize with her husband, but and win 2 Nobel Prizes, sorry. And then her daughter and son-in-law also won Nobel Prizes. So the question is, we need a paradigm shift. Who's going to lead this to sustainability? And here's where I think the MEES program offers some great examples of women science leaders who've made an impact, and including Holly Bamford and Debbie Bronk and Sue Williams, and Margie Mulholland, and Elizabeth North, Lisa Wanger, Judy O'Neill, the last 3 on the faculty here at UMCS. And then Rhiann Walsh, one of your instructors in this class, and Caroline Donovan, who also works with the Integration Application Network. So I'm hoping that next paradigm shift will be a MEES graduate, and will break the deadlock of dead white men. Thanks.